The tension in the university auditorium was thick enough to cut with a knife. 2,000 students packed into every seat, phones ready, knowing they were about to witness something explosive. The air seemed to vibrate with anticipation as hushed conversations and nervous laughter echoed through the massive hall. Security guards positioned themselves strategically throughout the venue, sensing that tonight would be different from the usual political debates. The stage lights blazed down on two men who couldn't be more different. Jonathan Roumie, the actor known for his deep and reflective roles, sat calmly in his simple suit, hands folded, exuding serene confidence. Across from him sat Dave Rubin, with fire in his eyes, sharp in his tailored jacket, projecting a sense of aggressive energy as he quickly checked his notes one final time and scanned the room. The contrast was striking. One man radiated a quiet strength, unbothered by the tension around him, while the other surveyed the crowd like a predator, ready to launch into battle. "You think you speak for the common man, Jonathan?" Dave's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You've spent your career in the bubble of Hollywood, detached from the real struggles of everyday Americans." The crowd erupted. Some cheered, others gasped, but everyone leaned forward. This wasn't going to be a polite political debate. Jonathan didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He just smiled that knowing smile that would soon become legendary. What happened next would break the internet, trend worldwide for 3 consecutive days, and prove that sometimes the quietest voice in the room carries the biggest punch. Dave thought he was about to destroy Jonathan with the same aggressive tactics he had used in countless interviews and debates to silence his opponents. Instead, he was about to learn why you should never underestimate a man who uses empathy, authenticity, and experience to engage in true dialogue. Before we dive into this epic showdown, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these incredible political moments that are reshaping America. The stage was set for war, but only one of these men knew how it would end. The university had promoted this event as a dialogue on the future of American political leadership. But everyone in attendance understood they were about to witness something far more consequential than a typical academic discussion. This was a clash between two fundamentally different visions of what it meant to be a public figure in modern American politics. And the winner would help define that conversation for years to come. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know who these two powerhouses really are and what brought them to this moment of inevitable collision. Jonathan Roumie strode onto the stage, not carrying the weight of a political empire, but the gravity of his years of experience in a career built on empathy and portraying deep, complex characters. Known for his powerful roles, Jonathan was a man of thoughtfulness, reflection, and a voice for the people, but without the typical trappings of political power. He had built his career on connecting with humanity, not through partisan warfare, but through compassion and truth. Dave Rubin, 46, had taken a very different path to the stage. A former progressive who turned to conservatism, Rubin had become a major figure in right-wing political commentary. His brand was built on speaking truths, according to his view, against the political left, often targeting mainstream media, cancel culture, and what he saw as the failures of liberal politics. He'd built an empire of followers by challenging what he deemed liberal orthodoxy. His audience loved him for his bold stance and often controversial opinions. Tonight, Rubin would represent a conservative vision of America's future, seeking to break the monopoly he believed the Democratic Party held over minority voters. Jonathan, on the other hand, embodied a new generation of thinkers who believed in inclusion, compassion, and unity without surrendering to the pressure of party lines. The university had scheduled this as a civil dialogue on race and politics, but everyone in that auditorium knew civility was about to go out the window. These weren't just two political figures with different views. They were representatives of two movements that saw each other as existential threats. The audience reflected that divide. Conservative students clustered on one side, phones ready to capture clips for social media. Progressive activists filled the other side, prepared to defend their champion. In the middle sat the undecided, the curious, the ones who would determine which man's message would dominate the headlines tomorrow. As the moderator introduced both speakers, you could feel the electricity in the air. This wasn't going to be a debate. It was going to be a battle for the soul of American political identity. Dave sat forward in his chair, already planning his attack. She'd done her research, prepared her talking points, and was ready to expose what she saw as Jonathan Roumie's hypocrisy. She thought she knew exactly how this would go. Jonathan Roumie sat back, calm as still water, watching Dave Rubin's body language, reading the room, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He'd studied Dave's previous debates, understood his tactics, and had prepared something special for tonight. Neither man knew it yet, but this confrontation would define both their careers and create a moment that would be studied in political science classes for years to come. The moderator asked the first question about economic policy in Black communities. It seemed harmless enough. It was about to become anything but harmless. The first few minutes seemed almost normal, almost civilized. Both men answered the moderator's questions about economic policy with their standard talking points, their voices measured and professional. Dave Rubin pushed his message about free market solutions, citing statistics on how entrepreneurship and limited government had historically driven success. Jonathan Roumie countered with arguments about systemic barriers and the need for comprehensive government investment, referencing data on wealth gaps and educational funding disparities. But anyone watching closely could see the real battle brewing beneath the surface, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Dave's voice got a little sharper with each answer, his gestures more animated, his eyes never leaving Jonathan's face. Jonathan's responses became more pointed, more direct, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. The audience sensed it too. The polite applause after each answer carried an edge of anticipation, and phones were already being raised in preparation for what everyone knew was coming. Then the moderator asked about criminal justice reform, and the gloves came off. The Democratic Party has failed Black communities for decades, Dave said, his voice rising. They promise reform every election cycle and deliver nothing but more crime, more poverty, more broken families. Meanwhile, leaders like Jonathan here get rich off their suffering. The conservative side of the audience erupted in cheers, their voices echoing off the auditorium's high ceiling. Jonathan's supporters booed loudly, some standing and pointing accusingly at Dave, but he held up a hand with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to controlling rooms full of hostile politicians, signaling them to stay calm and trust his process. That's an interesting perspective from someone who's never held elected office, Jonathan replied smoothly. It's easy to criticize from the outside. It's harder to actually do the work. Dave's eyes flashed. That it was exactly the kind of establishment dismissal that fired him up. Oh, so now we're playing the credentials game, Dave shot back, leaning forward. Let me tell you about credentials. I don't need a government paycheck to speak truth to power. I don't need to bow down to party bosses to have a voice. That's the difference between us, Jonathan. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Students on both sides were on the edges of their seats, phones recording every word. Jonathan nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Dave's point. You're absolutely right that we're different, Jonathan said, his voice steady but firm. I believe in showing up and doing the work, even when it's messy and complicated. Some people prefer to throw rocks from the sidelines. Sidelines? Dave's voice cracked like a whip. I've been fighting the liberal plantation mentality while you've been collecting checks from the same establishment that's kept our people down for generations. The phrase liberal plantation sent shockwaves through the room. Progressive students gasped and began shouting. Conservative supporters cheered even louder. The moderator tried to restore order, but the energy was too explosive to contain. Jonathan still didn't raise his voice. He waited for the noise to die down, then spoke into the microphone with deadly calm. That's quite a phrase coming from someone whose entire career has been built on telling white conservatives exactly what they want to hear about Black people. The progressive side exploded in applause. Dave's face flushed red. How dare you? Dave stood up, his chair scraping loudly across the stage. How dare you question my authenticity? I've sacrificed everything to speak truth to power while you've been playing the game, collecting your government salary and selling out our community to the highest bidder. The room was in chaos now. Students were on their feet, shouting at each other across the aisles. The moderator was banging his gavel, trying desperately to restore order. But Dave wasn't done. He pointed directly at Jonathan, his voice rising to a near scream. You want to talk about authenticity? Let's talk about your voting record. Let's talk about how you've done nothing but rubber stamp every failed Democratic policy while Black unemployment stays high and Black-owned businesses struggle. You're not a leader. You're a performer. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. This had gone way beyond political disagreement. This was personal now. Jonathan remained seated, his hands still folded, watching Dave's outburst with the calm attention of a scientist observing an interesting specimen. The contrast was striking. One man standing, gesticulating wildly, voice raised in anger, the other sitting peacefully, completely in control. "Are you finished?" Jonathan asked quietly, but his microphone picked up every word and carried it to the far corners of the auditorium. Dave was breathing hard, adrenaline pumping, ready to continue the attack. "I'm just getting started. You think because you have a title, because you went to law school, because you play the game the way they want you to play it, that makes you legitimate. You're everything that's wrong with Black leadership in this country." The personal attacks were getting more vicious by the second. Dave had abandoned any pretense of policy debate and was going straight for character assassination, his voice reaching levels that made several audience members wince. His supporters loved it. This was the Dave they'd come to see, the fearless truth teller who didn't back down from anyone. They whooped and cheered with each verbal blow, feeding his energy and pushing him to go even harder. But something subtle in Jonathan Roumie's expression, a slight tightening around his eyes, a barely perceptible shift in his posture, suggested that Dave Rubin had just made a serious tactical mistake. "You know what?" Dave continued, pacing now, feeding off the energy of his supporters. "I'm tired of people like you hiding behind your degrees and your titles while real Americans suffer. I'm tired of the fake respectability politics, the careful words, the playing it safe while our communities burn." He turned back to face Jonathan directly. "You sit there acting so calm and collected, but what have you actually accomplished? What have you actually done for our people besides give pretty speeches and cash government checks?" The moderator had given up trying to control the situation. This was beyond his pay grade now. Security guards had moved closer to the stage, ready to intervene if things got physical. Dave was building to his crescendo, the moment he thought would destroy Jonathan Roumie once and for all. "You want to know the truth?" he screamed, his voice echoing off the auditorium walls. "You're everything that's wrong with the Democratic Party. You're a puppet, a sellout, a plantation overseer keeping people in line for your white liberal masters." The words hit like lightning strikes. The entire auditorium fell silent for just a moment, shocked by the intensity of the attack. Then the noise exploded again. Cheers from conservatives who thought Dave had just delivered a knockout blow. Boos and shouts from progressives who were furious at the plantation analogy. In the middle of it all, Jonathan Roumie sat quietly, waiting. He had let Dave exhaust himself, absorbed every attack, and allowed his opponent to reveal exactly who he really was to a room full of witnesses and cameras. Now it was his turn. The auditorium slowly quieted as everyone realized Jonathan was about to respond. Dave stood there breathing hard, sweat beading on his forehead, convinced he had just delivered the performance of his career. He had thrown everything he had at Jonathan, questioned his authenticity, attacked his record, used the most inflammatory language possible. Jonathan looked up at him calmly, then turned to address the crowd directly. "Mr. Rubin, are you finished?" His voice was so quiet that the entire auditorium had to strain to hear, but that only made everyone listen more intently. Dave, still high on adrenaline from his outburst, gestured dismissively. "I'm finished exposing you, if that's what you mean." Jonathan nodded slowly as if considering this. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. "I want to thank you, Dave. You've just given everyone in this room a perfect demonstration of something I've been trying to explain to young people for years." He stood up for the first time, moving with unhurried grace to the center of the stage. The contrast with Dave's frantic energy was striking. "You've shown us the difference between noise and substance, between performance and leadership, between burning bridges and building them." The progressive side of the audience began to perk up, sensing that their champion was about to strike back. "You spent the last 10 minutes screaming at me, calling me names, questioning my authenticity, all while proving exactly why your approach fails. Our community suffers every single day." Jonathan's voice remained conversational, almost friendly, but there was steel underneath. "You called me a plantation overseer. You said I'm everything wrong with Black leadership. You questioned what I've accomplished." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Let me tell you what I've accomplished, since you asked." And then Jonathan Roumie began to dismantle Dave Rubin with the precision of a master surgeon. "In my career, I've used my platform to raise millions for charity and advocate for social justice reform. I've produced projects that shed light on the struggles of marginalized communities, from their fight for equality to their battle against systemic oppression. The progressive side began to applaud, but Jonathan raised his hand for silence. He wasn't done. I've held hundreds of events across the country, from community centers to local theaters, meeting people where they live. I've listened to their stories, learned from their struggles, and done everything in my power to amplify their voices. His voice grew stronger, more confident. I've worked with both Democrats and Republicans, finding common ground where possible, pushing for criminal justice reform, and advocating for equitable access to health care. I've helped thousands of families get the services they need through community outreach programs. The crowd, energized by his words, began to cheer. Jonathan didn't let it stop him. The difference between you and me, Dave, is that I don't profit from telling people what they want to hear. I profit from doing the hard work of bringing real change to people's lives. I don't make my living by convincing others that systemic racism doesn't exist. I work to change the systems that perpetuate it. The progressive side erupted in cheers, but Jonathan wasn't finished. He turned to look directly at Dave, who was standing frozen, clearly not expecting this level of detailed response. You want to talk about authenticity? Let's talk about authenticity. Jonathan pulled out his phone, a move that confused everyone until he began to read from it. This is from your social media account 3 years ago. I don't experience racism because I don't think like a victim. He paused, then continued. That same week, a black woman in Georgia was shot by police in her own home. Her name was Breonna Taylor. Remember her? The auditorium fell silent. This was getting real now. You told your followers that if black people would just stop thinking like victims, racism would disappear. Tell that to the families in my district who've been redlined out of home ownership for generations. Tell that to the black mothers I work with who have to give their sons the talk about how to survive police encounters. Dave tried to interrupt. That's not what I'm not finished, Jonathan said firmly. The authority in his voice made Dave step back. You want to know the difference between us? When you see injustice, you blame the victims. When I see injustice, I work to change the system. You profit from telling people their struggles are their own fault. I work to address the root causes of those struggles. Jonathan began walking slowly across the stage, speaking directly to different sections of the audience. To the young people in this audience, don't let anyone tell you that your only choices are to be silent or to be loud. Don't let anyone convince you that fighting for justice makes you a victim or a sellout. You can be strong without being angry. You can be proud without tearing others down. The applause was building, but Jonathan Roumie raised his voice slightly to be heard over it. Mr. Rubin, you accuse me of being a puppet. Jonathan's voice was calm, his expression unwavering. That's ironic because puppeteers are the ones who manipulate others into thinking their suffering is their own fault, telling them if they just work harder, everything will be fine. The historical parallel hit like a thunderbolt striking the auditorium. Students throughout the venue gasped audibly, and even some of Dave Rubin's most devoted supporters looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact with the progressive students around them. The comparison was devastating in its accuracy and impossible to dismiss. You've built your entire career on that same message, telling people that systemic racism is just an illusion, that poverty is a choice, and that if we just pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, everything will work out. It's the same lie told by different people for different reasons, but with the same damaging result. Jonathan stopped in the center of the stage, facing the entire audience. But here's what you don't understand, and what your conservative backers don't want you to understand. Real change requires real work. It requires showing up. It requires building coalitions. It requires the kind of patient, persistent effort that doesn't generate viral videos or best-selling books. He turned back to Dave Rubin, who had remained silent during this dismantling, clearly overwhelmed by the specificity and force of the response. You called me a puppet. Let me ask you something, Dave. Who pays your salary? Whose talking points are you pushing? Whose agenda benefits when you convince people to stop fighting for justice? The questions hung in the air like smoke. Dave opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I'll tell you who benefits, Jonathan continued. The same people who benefit from every status quo that's ever oppressed our community. The same people who would rather have one voice attacking another than see both of us working together to tear down the barriers that hold all of us back. The progressive side of the audience was on its feet now, but Jonathan wasn't playing to them. He was speaking to the whole room, including Dave Rubin's supporters. You want to talk about the liberal plantation? Let's talk about real plantations. Let's talk about the fact that your conservative allies opposed every single piece of civil rights legislation in history. Let's talk about how they're trying to ban books that tell the truth about that history. He paused, letting that sink in. I don't serve on any plantation, Dave. I serve the people who elected me. I serve the community that raised me. I serve the future that our children deserve. The auditorium was electric now, but Jonathan wasn't done. He had one more shot to fire. You know what the real tragedy is here? You're incredibly talented. You're smart, articulate, passionate. You could be using those gifts to actually help our community instead of performing for people who see you as their one good black friend. He walked closer to Dave, his voice becoming almost gentle. But instead, you've chosen to make your living by telling people that racism is over, that black people just need to try harder, that our pain is our own fault. And when that message gets challenged, when someone like me shows up with receipts and results, you resort to screaming and name-calling because you don't have facts to back up your talking points. Dave finally found his voice. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Jonathan cut him off. I know that you've never held elected office, but you want to tell those of us who have how to do our jobs. I know that you've never had to fight for funding for your community's schools, but you want to lecture about us about education policy. I know that you've never had to comfort a mother whose son was killed by police, but you want to tell us that police brutality is a myth. The attacks were precise, personal, devastating. You want to know what I see when I look at you, Dave? I see someone who's afraid that if you acknowledge racism exists, you'll lose your conservative audience. Afraid that if you admit systemic barriers are real, you'll have to do the hard work of fighting them instead of just talking about them. He stopped directly in front of Dave, looking him in the eye. Most of all, I see someone who's forgotten that our ancestors didn't survive slavery, Jim Crow, and everything else just so their descendants could get rich by telling white people that black suffering is black people's fault. The auditorium erupted. Students were on their feet, cheering, applauding, whistling. Even some of Dave Rubin's supporters looked stunned by the precision and power of Jonathan's response. Dave stood there visibly shaken, clearly unprepared for this level of systematic dismantling. He had come to this stage expecting to dominate a typical politician with his aggressive style. Instead, he had run into someone who had done his homework, someone who had facts and receipts, someone who could match his passion with substance. Dave started, then stopped. For the first time in years, he seemed to have nothing to say. Jonathan nodded at him almost sympathetically. It's okay, Dave. When you're ready to have a real conversation about helping our community instead of performing for your donors, you know where to find me. I'll be at work. The mic drop moment wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quiet, confident, devastatingly effective in its understatement. Jonathan Roumie had just shown an entire auditorium and millions of people watching online how to dismantle a bad faith attack with facts, grace, and surgical precision. He had turned what was supposed to be his destruction into his coronation as a new kind of political leader, one who could be strong without being loud, powerful without being cruel, victorious without being vindictive. The auditorium was still buzzing as the event officially ended, but the real action was just beginning. Within minutes, phones across the room were lighting up with notifications. Social media was about to explode as students filed out. The conversations were intense. Groups huddled around phones, watching replays of Jonathan's response. Even some who had come as Dave's supporters were shaking their heads, clearly impacted by what they'd witnessed. Did you see his face when Jonathan started listing those numbers? One student whispered to their friend. I thought Dave was going to destroy him, another admitted. But damn, the actor came with receipts. The contrast in how the two men left the stage told the whole story. Dave Rubin hurried off, surrounded by his handlers, clearly shaken and avoiding the press area that had been set up. Jonathan Roumie took his time, stopping to shake hands with students, answer a few questions from reporters, completely composed. Mr. Roumie, how did you prepare for Mr. Rubin's attacks? A journalist asked. Jonathan smiled. I prepared the same way I prepare for everything, by doing my homework and remembering who I work for. Meanwhile, social media was catching fire. The hashtag number Jonathan receipts started trending within 20 minutes. Video clips of his response were spreading across every platform. The most viral moment wasn't even his strongest attack. It was the quiet way he said, "Are you finished?" before beginning his systematic dismantling. That 8-second clip would be turned into thousands of memes and reaction videos. Conservative Twitter was in damage control mode. Dave Rubin's supporters tried to spin the confrontation, claiming he had been ambushed or that the audience was biased, but even they seemed to recognize that something significant had happened. Dave got fact-checked in real time. One honest conservative commentator tweeted, "That's what happens when performance meets preparation." The progressive side was euphoric. Calm and collected began trending alongside Howard Jonathan receipts. Democratic leaders who had been watching started sharing clips with comments like, "This is how it's done," and "leadership in action." But the most telling reactions came from the middle. The people who weren't particularly political, who had watched the confrontation out of curiosity rather than partisan loyalty. "I didn't know who either of these men were before tonight." One viral tweet read, "Now I know which one I'd want representing me." The video numbers were staggering. The full confrontation had been live-streamed to over 300,000 viewers. But within hours, various clips had been viewed millions of times across all platforms. The "Are you finished?" moment alone hit 2.3 million views in its first day. News outlets scrambled to cover the story. Political commentators who had expected a typical shouting match found themselves analyzing something much more sophisticated, a masterclass in how to respond to bad faith attacks with grace and substance. What we witnessed tonight wasn't just a debate, one analyst observed. It was a generational changing of the guard in political leadership. Jonathan Roumie showed that you don't have to choose between being strong and being substantive. The impact extended far beyond social media. Within days, Jonathan Roumie's congressional office reported a 400% increase in volunteer applications. Small dollar donations poured in from across the country. Most importantly, the specific policies he had mentioned during his response, the small business funding, the social justice reform, and the criminal justice reform initiatives, suddenly had national attention. 3 days after the confrontation, a major news network released polling data that shocked political observers. Among younger voters under 35, Jonathan Roumie's favorable ratings had jumped 23 points. Even more surprising, his favorability among suburban voters had increased by 18 points. He showed that you can be tough without being nasty, one focus group participant explained. He was strong but not angry, confident but not arrogant. That's what leadership looks like. The long-term implications were even more significant. Conservative media had spent years promoting figures like Dave Rubin, who validated their audience's beliefs about race and politics. The confrontation exposed the weakness of that strategy. When those voices encountered someone with actual experience and concrete achievements, the performance fell apart. For progressive politics, Jonathan Roumie's response became a template. Other political figures began studying his approach, how to respond to personal attacks with policy specifics, how to stay calm under pressure, how to turn defense into offense without losing moral authority. The confrontation also highlighted a broader shift in American politics. The era of purely performative political theater was giving way to something more substantive. Voters, especially younger voters, were increasingly hungry for leaders who could back up their rhetoric with results. Dave Rubin tried to recover in the following weeks. He appeared on friendly shows, wrote defensive social media posts, attempted to reframe the confrontation as a victory, but the damage was done. The video of him screaming while Jonathan sat calmly had become iconic, a perfect visual metaphor for the difference between noise and leadership. More importantly, his core argument that political figures who work within progressive systems are somehow betraying their community had been thoroughly dismantled. Jonathan Roumie had shown with specific examples and concrete numbers what actual representation looked like. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. One man built his career by telling conservative audiences what they wanted to hear about marginalized communities. The other built his career by doing the hard work of real representation. 3 months later, when a major political magazine published its annual Rising Stars issue, Jonathan Roumie was on the cover. The headline read, "The Future of American Leadership." In the accompanying interview, he reflected on the confrontation with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I think what that night showed is that the American people are ready for something different," he said. "They're tired of the shouting and the performance. They want leaders who show up, do the work, and deliver results. That's not Republican or Democratic. That's just good leadership." The interviewer asked if he had any regrets about how he handled Dave Rubin's attacks. Jonathan considered the question carefully. "I regret that we've created a political culture where that kind of confrontation was necessary, but I don't regret standing up for the work we're doing and the people we serve. He paused, then added with a slight smile, though next time I might not be quite so patient waiting for them to finish their tantrum. The confrontation had indeed changed both men's careers, but in opposite directions that neither could have fully anticipated. Dave Rubin found his influence waning as more people began questioning the substance behind his provocative style. With several high-profile speaking engagements quietly canceled and book sales declining for the first time in years, Jonathan Roumie found himself with a national platform and the credibility to use it effectively, receiving invitations to speak at major universities and policy conferences across the country. But perhaps the most important impact was on the young people who had witnessed the exchange. Not just those in the auditorium, but the millions who watched clips online and shared them with friends and family across the country, in classrooms, community centers, dorm rooms, and family kitchens. Young women, especially young Black women, were learning a new lesson about power and leadership that would shape their own approach to activism in public service. You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to tear others down to build yourself up. You don't have to choose between being strong and being substantive. Sometimes the most powerful response to anger is calm. Sometimes the best answer to noise is substance. Sometimes the way to win isn't to fight fire with fire, but to fight fire with facts. As one young woman posted on social media the day after the confrontation, Jonathan Roumie just showed me what I want to be when I grow up. Not just successful, but successful with integrity. That might have been the most important victory of all. The story of Dave Rubin screaming at Jonathan Roumie while the actor responded with calm authority has become more than just a viral moment. It's become a symbol of what authentic leadership looks like in the modern age. It proved that sometimes the most powerful response to aggression is grace, and the best answer to performance is substance. What do you think? Did Jonathan handle this perfectly, or should he have fought fire with fire? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these incredible moments that are reshaping American politics. The next confrontation could be even more explosive, and you won't want to miss it.